Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Hello, I'm Rhombus Tix, and I'm going to be reading a short story for you called Snail Summer in the series that I'm calling Swamp Castle. Opsa was sure that there had to have been a time when people did not think that farms were places of simplicity or virtue. There had to be, but she had never read of one. Opsa's cousin from the country was visiting because she couldn't behave. It was so cliché it sickened her. That was why Opsa was bound and determined to find a way to get into as much mischief as possible. Things were interesting down on the farm, and Opsa meant to prove it. There were no lights in this section. There didn't have to be. Anyone who worked here had implants that let them see into the UV spectrum in order to harvest the kip bats. They hated any frequency of light that was visible on the human spectrum. It also made a very useful place to hide things you didn't want your parents to find. Now that she thought about it, Opsa realized the guano vats could make some interesting informational material for Kili. She looked around at the kennels. All of the kip bats were sleeping soundly, clinging together cutely in their little pods. They were amazing creatures. All of the clothing Opsa wore was spun from their silky threads. All of the milk produced on the planet came from them as well. Opsa made a scrunchy face at the idea of eating them in a stew, though. They tasted terrible. Opsa checked all the milking posts to make sure that they were working. The faint glow of cold plasma leaked down one wall. She didn't understand how it worked, but she knew that if the milk got outside, it would be ruined. Her job was to make sure that the machines were doing what they were supposed to do. Hardly hyperspace mathematics. There was a soft keening sound as the jock bat flew into the room. She winked at it. It keened an enthusiastic greening, but softly so as not to wake up the kip bats. In an hour, once the moon rose, it would fly out and herd them into the fields. She was done here. She grabbed a pack of surprises and headed out. As she walked through the glowing fields of cement rice, she tried to avoid any of the accumulated mud puddles. She brushed her hair and hummed to herself. There was plenty of time to think on the long walk. Opsa had a lot to think about. Why had her uncle foisted her cousin on her anyway? Was she getting paid to act as a babysitter? No, of course she wasn't. The train was swift, efficient, and silent. This was spillover country. She saw the train on the horizon one moment, followed by a bright blue flash that deposited Kili in a crumpled, disoriented heap on the ground. Kili's parents hadn't paid for the more expensive but far more comfortable transition. Kili? Opsa asked. Kili stood up, dusted herself off, and smiled innocently. Opsa? Opsa nodded and moved forward to hug her cousin. It had been 7 years, but Kili had grown up a huge amount in that time. She was hardly recognizable. She already had breasts and was dressed in the latest fashion. Opsa suddenly felt very plain and didn't like it. Kili said, "It's pretty late. Can we go home and get sleep?" Opsa replied, "Sure, no problem." She smiled and didn't tell her cousin that bat farmers were up during the night and asleep during that part of the day. Opsa should have been able to take delight in tormenting her cousin with the horrible things that awaited her while working on the farm, but Opsa's heart wasn't in it, and that pissed her off. She'd been planning this for days. In the back of her mind, she shuffled through the various frightening things that she could say to her cousin to mess with Kili's head. The smell of bacon and toast wafted through the kitchen. Opsa's mother was very busy cooking up breakfast. She smiled. So much for sparing her cousin. Opsa had forgotten her mother's way of acclimatizing visitors to the Hillhawk household. "Good morning, Kili. How was your trip?" Mother said while mixing pancake batter. "Nauseating. I don't like this Star Train." "Your father isn't made of money, dear. Ships cost a lot more, especially here. Put your things into your room and come back down." Kili looked confused. "I was kind of hoping to sleep," Opsa's mother said. "I think you'll find it a lot easier to just get it over with." Kili said, Get what over with?" Opsa smiled sadly. "Switching to stay up at night." "What?" Opsa's mother said. "Your mother sent you here to learn some lessons, Kili. That means we're building character." Opsa said, "Building character means I know what it means. I watch TV." Kili tore a chunk of bread with predatory fervor. Opsa smiled. Have you ever built character before? Opsa's mother shushed Opsa. What she means is, have you ever worked on a farm before? If I did, Kili grumbled. Obviously I didn't get enough character the first time around, or I wouldn't be here. Opsa and her mother chuckled. Opsa's mother said, I guess not. Well, if you're not sleeping, you might as well get some breakfast. Sit down, and I'll cook it for you. Opsa's mother cooked up a storm. Opsa hadn't had breakfast this nice since Christmas. She knew that it was a special occasion and that she wanted to make Kili feel at home. It had worked. Kili seemed a lot less nervous as the three of them chatted for half an hour about all kinds of family gossip. Opsa and Kili went out to let the bats feed. The temperature of the planet's surface was still frosty, making little clouds in the air with their breath each time they talked. So what exactly do we have to do? Kili asked with apprehension. Guess, Opsa said. Kili smiled. Or I could just sit here and watch you and then tell Uncle Thake that you wouldn't tell me what to do, Opsa smirked. I think he'll believe me over you, Kili laughed. Maybe, but I don't think so. I'm willing to take that risk. Are you? Opsa shrugged and smiled. She didn't say anything back, and silence loomed between the two of them for the next 2 hours. It got awkward. Opsa was busy in yet another chore, concocting an elaborate plan to get Kili to stand right where the guano would discharge for the trucks when she heard snoring. Opsa grinned demonically. Suddenly she didn't need an elaborate plan. She carefully and silently went over to one of the hover lifts. Those trays were designed to carry weight vastly larger than they were, and they were utterly silent. Opsa clipped 3 hooks to Kili's shirt and pants and then let her rip. Gently, peacefully, Kili floated in the air. She smiled and cuddled up to something imaginary. Opsa could only imagine what she was dreaming about. Once Kili was in place, Opsa gently let the hover lift settle down. Then she pushed the right button. The scream was well worth the lecture her father gave her. The next morning, the two of them were out at it again. This time, Opsa was going to have to show Kili what to do. Kili looked very tired and very annoyed. Opsa wasn't very sympathetic. Let the bats out so you can feed them. And what does that mean? We push some buttons, so their perches retract and the doors open. Opsa began pushing the buttons in question. That's it? Not quite. We monitor them to protect them from predators, but it's pretty mindless work, Kili said. Mindless work is supposed to build character? Work is supposed to build character, Opsa laughed. You buy that? Not really. But I buy that my parents believe it, though. They're basically good people. I love them, but they're pretty old-fashioned, Kili laughed. No kidding. It's not all so boring. There are only so many things that the cleaning bots can clean. There are an awful lot of filters in the system too weirdly shaped for anything but a robot that's too expensive to use for that kind of thing or too stupid to do it. Huh? Fun, huh? That's disgusting. Can't your parents just hire someone to do it? Kili asked. Sure, but why? When they have labor for free. Don't they love you? Kili asked, horrified. Of course they do. That's the worst part. They do it because they love us and because it builds character. Right, Kili said. So, what's a morphing snail? Opsa's eyebrows went up. Who told you about that? I read about this place before I came here. I wanted to know if I was going to get mauled or something. Well, the bats eat them. They're kind of like earth snails, but they picked up some weird DNA or something. Do snails count as animals? Kili asked. I think so. Why are they called morphing snails? That's easy. Want to see? Opsa asked. Sure. The moon was full and glowed down upon the wheat fields as the two girls moved in amongst the crops by taking the shallow irrigation ditches. The water splashed up on their lower legs, so they had to stop and rolled up their pants. Pretty soon, they had both slipped and slid enough to have most of their skin covered in mud. So, what does a morphing snail look like? Kili looked up under a rock as if hoping to find one there. Most of the time it looks like a snail, Opsa said as she stepped over yet another mud puddle. When doesn't it look like a snail? When they're about to get eaten by a kipbat. Kili looked around for snails that weren't there. What do they do when they're about to get eaten by a kipbat? Most of the time they look human. Opsa did her best impression for Kili. What? Opsa smiled. Somehow they've merged with something here so they can change their shape. Ever hear of how a rabbit scream sounds like a human scream? Uh-huh. Well, this is a lot worse. This sounds like children, and their faces look like them. That's disgusting. Kili stopped walking and stared at Opsa. You have no idea, Opsa giggled. Do you know where to find one? Kili walked quickly to catch up with her cousin. I do. Then I want to see. The two of them went across a field of cattails, carefully wading in the knee-high water. A soft wind began to blow into their faces from the north. The leaves on the trees were too bright a shade of green that matched the new moon, but they had just the slightest tinge of orange to them, reflecting the change of seasons. The faintest flicker of sunlight appeared on the distant horizon, indicating light was coming in a few hours. The two of them found a game path and eventually left the marshy area, which became a light forest. There was a soft blue glow that came in from the ground. Opsa put her finger to her lips and signaled her cousin to silence as they moved forward. The soft blue glow increased and coalesced into a visible slime trail. We're close, Opsa said in a whispering voice. Don't say anything until I tell you. Opsa and Kili went up from a small hill as quietly as they could go. Opsa made another sign for Kili to be quiet as they moved forward. Then, out of nowhere, Opsa shouted a fierce shriek that imitated the howl of a kipbat. Kili was about to turn around and say something angrily when Opsa caught her by the shoulder and pointed forward. There, among the reeds, Kili saw a fiery glow. Opsa shrieked a second time and the glow got brighter. As Opsa moved forward and shrieked a third time, Kili finally saw it. The snail was large, about the size of her father's fist. It was marbled with gray and orange streaks that glowed brightly. It had also left a faint trail behind it that glowed like it did. Most alarming, however, was that it flattened itself like a flapjack and then morphed its face into a screaming child. It looked like someone was putting their face up into cellophane and screaming into it. After a few seconds, the screaming started. It sounded just like a human, but with a faint liquid slopping sound in the background. Kili ran. Opsa giggled and ran after her. After a few minutes of running, Kili finally stopped. She was out of breath. Between pants, she started to say, "What was that?" That was a morphing snail. I've never seen anything like it, Opsa smiled. Well, there's all kinds of interesting things out here. But how did they learn to do that? I don't know, Opsa shrugged. Kili sighed. I'm no zoologist, but that seems kind of weird. What do you mean? Morphing snails mimic all kinds of things. They're good at it. Sure, I could expect them to imitate kipbats, but people? Do people eat morphing snails? Kili slowly stood up. She was still a little shaky. I don't know. Why not? Opsa figured maybe the snail could tell her. She did a good imitation of a kipbat, but maybe it could tell. As far as she was concerned, that was just the way it had always been. Because it doesn't make sense. Because, Kili thought for a few seconds and then said, because humans aren't the ones hunting them. Kipbats might be afraid of people, but they are probably afraid of those things. Afraid of a lot of things. Why people? Why little kids? At first, Opsa thought Kili was just being stupid, but when Opsa thought about it, it was a good question. I don't know, Opsa said with a quieter voice and shrugged again. Maybe we can ask Uncle Thake? Yeah, Dad might know. It was weird hearing her father called Uncle anything. He was just Dad. The two of them went back and resumed their chores around the farm. The morning sun was high in the sky before they were through. They were exhausted by the time they were both finished. Both of them nearly forgot to ask until just before bedtime. Opsa's father, Uncle Thake, was a solid man who had built up years of muscle from hard work. He came to wish Opsa good night and to see if Kili was all settled in when she asked her question. Morphing snails. Why do you want to know about those pests? Opsa said. Pests? Sure. A pack of morphing snails will scare the bats so bad their milk will go sour for a month. Nasty little things. If you see one, feel free to crush it. He looked like he was about to spit on the floor but stopped. Opsa smiled when she realized it was because of Kili's presence. Wouldn't want to look crude in front of the sophisticated members of the family, after all. Opsa said, You never said that they were a pest before. You never asked before. Now, why do you want to know about them? Kili's curious. All right. They sure are weird critters, I'll grant you that. He scratched the back of his head casually. Kili said, How long have they been able to look like human children? Thake thought about this for a moment and said, Hard to say. People started noticing about 20 years ago, so I imagine it was sometime around then. Has anyone ever studied what makes them act that way? Sure have. Every few years, some new scientist comes hoping to crack the mystery. They've all gone back empty-handed, though. Not a one of them has figured it out. It's a big universe and a small planet. Most of them went on to do better things. Now, enough about the snails. I want you to sleep. They took the hint. Both of them quickly nodded off. Kili didn't sleep well. Opsa patted her shoulder at breakfast. You'll get used to it. She was only slightly condescending. Kili had proven a lot cooler than Opsa had thought she would be. Kili... Opsa patted her shoulder at breakfast. You'll get used to it. She was only slightly condescending. Kili had proven a lot cooler than Opsa had thought she would be. Kili nodded absently while eating another bagel. She seemed to stare into space. At first, Opsa thought she had an evening zombie sickness and set to repeat herself. But then she realized Kili was on the hypernet. She was probably looking at more stuff about morphing snails. Kili still hadn't said anything about it while they did their chores. Opsa wanted to give her some space, but her curiosity kept bubbling up inside her. Finally, she could hold it no longer and burst out, What did you find? Huh? About the snails? Oh, not much. Kili shrugged and kicked some hay. Nothing? Opsa said. Well, almost nothing. Almost? Opsa stopped pushing buttons and moved to look up at Kili face to face. Well, none of the scientists I read about ever stayed more than a couple of months. So, what's the deal with that? It's weird. Opsa moved back to her console and started the milk processing again. It didn't seem that interesting anymore. Kili said, Back home, my best friend's dad is a scientist. Everyone thinks that it's cool until they see him working. Kagi, my best friend back home, says that he doesn't do anything all day, and when she complains, he says that it takes a long time to do good science. She said the last sentence as in grown-ups are large and boring voice. So, a couple of months isn't a long time. It is to me, Opsa said, had finished pushing the buttons on the milk processing and started pumping it into storage. Me too. But Kagi's dad says it always takes him years to get good results. So why would these guys come all this way here and not finish what they started? Opsa thought for a while, pushing buttons silently. Kili watched her until she finished. Once she was done, Opsa said, This is the busiest season of the year for us. They move school around so we can get the farm work done. But that means that there are no concerts, no festivals, and no dances for 2 months. We're all supposed to concentrate on the bats. Kili shrugged a little. I understand. Opsa laughed. No, you don't. Do you think that we can really work 16 hours a day? Things get really boring here during milk season. So I think that as long as we do our chores, why can't we solve your little mystery? Kili squealed with delight and clapped her hands. She hugged her cousin. Opsa hugged back, but couldn't quite muster her enthusiasm. It was kind of interesting. Maybe it was something to do. So where do we start? Well, I know that on TV they always make a map. That always seems to tell people something, Opsa said. What about the scientists? Yeah, they're important. Maybe you could find out about what made them leave? What if they lie? Why would scientists lie? Kili said. I don't know, a conspiracy? The snail conspiracy? Kili giggled. I'll just mail them. So you make your map. Just what are you going to make a map of? Opsa pulled a lever as she looked off into space pensively. Anything I can think of. I mainly think we should see what the snails are and maybe what the snails that imitate people are. Makes as much sense as anything else, I guess. Opsa pulled the lever back to its original position. They began to research the area. After a few days, Opsa had emailed 10 scientists and only heard back from one of them. Her enthusiasm quickly began to wane, though. This was too much like school. Kili kept right on it for 2 weeks straight. By that time she was done, she had more maps about snails than she knew what to do with. That was the new problem. Kili and Opsa showed the maps to as many people as they could find, and no one knew anything. It got so bad that Opsa's mother forbade any discussion about snails from the dinner table. The two of them were about to give up until Opsa checked her email. She had received responses from a few more people. In fact, 9 of the 10 had answered back. At first, they didn't see anything in the notes that really meant anything. Then one night, when they were by the fire, staring at some maps that they had been staring at for 3 weeks, Kili finally went nuts. It's the snails! They're mind-controlling the scientists to leave them alone. Opsa got a weird look on her face. Do you really believe that? Kili rushed into the kitchen and came back with a roll of tinfoil. I must make a hat to keep out their evil snail race. They're in my mind. They're in my brain. Opsa smacked Kili on the back of the head. Stop that, Kili groaned. No more maps, please. No more maps. I'll trade you. I'm not getting anywhere with these emails either. Then maybe we should just stop, Kili said. That's it. What? They all found better things to do, Opsa stood. What? They got offers for research that interested them more elsewhere. So, Kili stared at Opsa, shocked. So someone got them off the planet. Someone powerful. Or someone very, very smart. Yes, but why? They're just snails. Snails that can look like people, Kili said. Only kind of. Maybe it was a circus? Kili watched Opsa pace back and forth. No. Why not? Kili looked upset at how fast Opsa had shot down her idea. Anyone could pick up a snail anywhere. Yeah, well, not anywhere, but lots of places. Opsa laughed. You are a snail expert now. Maybe the snails really are bad for the kip bats. They're not just bad for the bats. The bats eat the snails, but they're bad for the farmers. Didn't your dad say how bad they were for the milk? Maybe it's the snails themselves, Kili said. Back to the tinfoil again? Opsa smiled. No, hear me out. What if they're aliens and they're intelligent? And the face of a screaming child is the best that they can do? Kili shrugged. It just sounds like more trouble than it's worth. She put her hand to her forehead. What I do know is that they're all giving me a headache, Opsa beamed. Kili, that's it. You're a genius. Kili said, Oh, yes, of course I am. Opsa just stopped smiling and smirked. Why are you a genius? Just general principle. Just that, huh? Yep. Kili folded her arms. Opsa started smiling again. Would you like to know why I called you a genius? Sure. Kili nonchalantly looked at her fingernails. Well, you are a genius. You figure it out. Opsa! Opsa laughed. Okay, I figured it out. Pharma drug companies. Huh? There must be a drug that they get from the snails, and they don't want to let their competitors know about. Kili put her hands underneath her chin. Well, I guess it does make sense. I guess. I mean, it explains about the scientists, but not why the snails got their screaming face thing. Opsa deflated. Oh, right. She perked up again. But I think I know which drug company it is. I bet we check them out. If we check them out, we might be able to figure out why the snails do what they do. Sounds good, but which company? There's only one drug company that really does a lot here. They get a lot of stuff from the kip bats. Ew. Kili made a disgusted face. You go, ew, from bats you drink, but not the snails? They're snails. Snails are icky. That makes no sense, Opsa said. So what now? Any way we can get into that factory? Kili looked at up a satellite picture of their destination. We can try. Neither of them were well trained in covert ops, but they did go ahead and make some preparations. They brought sandwiches and some drinks. They also brought a backpack full of rope, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a pen, and a pad of paper. Kili wanted to sneak in at night, but Opsa explained that things were busier at night than during the day, so they waited until noon. Kili's second idea proved much more effective. They both wore their school uniforms and pretended to be on a field trip. Both of them rushed past the stunned guard, saying that they were late with the rest of their group. The guard only smiled then and shook his head as they ran past. Once they were out of earshot, Kili said, Wow, I can't believe that worked. Yeah, me either. Maybe it didn't. Opsa looked around nervously. Don't start that. Let's just find the snails and get out of here. Kili started off down the hall. Opsa nodded in agreement and followed her. The factory was huge. It crisscrossed inside a lot of local bat caves with the tunnels to funnel the bats to where they were supposed to go. There were also a lot of very large assembly lines, though most of those were entirely automated. Neither of them had realized how large the place was. They were inside for a few hours. Once or twice, people looked at them strangely, but no alarm bells sounded and no one came to kick them out. Both girls got very tired. Finally, they had to rest. Kili leaned against a wall. We're not finding anything. Opsa sat down beside her. She broke out one of the sandwiches she'd brought with her. Opsa handed another one to Kili. Yeah, I didn't think we'd make it this far. What did you think was going to happen? I thought they'd lock us up and call my dad. At best, I figured we'd give up and go home at this point. Yeah, Kili said between sandwich bites. So do you think we should go home? I don't know. Well, what do you think? I don't know. You don't know? Opsa said, mildly annoyed. Yeah, I'm tired. Me too. Kili bit more of her sandwich. Then why not go home? Because. Because why? Kili finished her sandwich. Because we haven't found anything. Do you think we will find something? Opsa was honestly curious. I don't know. Maybe. Kili shrugged. Well, then where are we going to stop? I don't know. That's stupid, Opsa yelled. You're stupid, Kili laid back. Someone else screamed. Both girls were silent and looked at each other. For a few seconds, no one did anything. Finally, the screaming stopped and Kili moved down the hall to where the scream came from. Opsa was right behind her. There was a large white door with a glass window. They both had to stand up tiptoes to see what was inside. It was a small circular room with glass tanks. Each of the tanks had a snail wandering around the gravel that lined the bottom. Every few seconds, a screen would flash with the face of a screaming child. There was no sound at first, but after the 10th time, there was a slight electric charge on all the cages, which caused the snails to start to scream along. Kili and Opsa were out of there so fast that it felt like they were flying. The image of those screaming snails was so seared into their brain that they didn't even realize that they were screaming themselves until they were outside of the factory. They hid behind a large leafy tree. Opsa panted. What was that? Kili said. The drug company is teaching the snails to scream. Why? Well, Kili said, looking up for a moment, maybe they didn't want people to know about the snails? How does teaching them to scream help that? If anything, it makes them more noticeable. But then, what does it all mean? Opsa stuck up her chin and pointed back to the factory. I say we go ask them. Kili groaned. Do we have to go back there? I'm tired. Do you want to know what's going on with the snails? Yes. Then come on, Opsa said, taking Kili by the hand. Opsa found it ironic that she was the one taking the lead now. Let's go. There were 2 guards now, since the night shift was just starting in a full swing. They didn't bat an eye as the 2 girls on a field trip just walked inside. It helped that they were different guards, but Opsa still found it weird. Opsa found a terminal and used it to guide them to the president's office. The corridors were full of people moving along in various departments. Eventually, the 2 of them arrived at their destination. Outside of the door, Opsa said, We must look a mess. I've been awake for almost 24 hours now. Me too, but I've got an idea, Kili said. What? Trust me. Why? Why not just tell me? Because if I tell you, I'll have to hear myself say it, and I won't have the guts to do it, Kili said. Oh, go ahead then. The 2 of them marched in and saw an older girl, probably 19 or 20, waiting at the desk. She looked up from her terminal and said, Can I help you? Kili nodded. We're here for our appointment. The secretary looked puzzled. What appointment? Why, our appointment to talk with your boss about the school assignment, of course. Kili let out a bit of panic in her voice to highlight tension. I'm afraid I book all of Mr. Flemmer's appointments, and I assure you, I haven't heard anything about this, but Kili looked like she was going to cry. Opsa was impressed. Kili was a lost puppy dog, just accidentally kicked while opening your front car door. The secretary smiled. Just wait here. I'll see what I can do. She got up and went into the office behind her. A short while later, she came back and led them into the office. The president was fat. He must have weighed 180 pounds without drugs. He probably would have weighed at least twice that. Much to Opsa's surprise, he also had a very trustable face and shining happy eyes. When the girls entered, he stood up from his chair. I understand that we have an appointment. Kili burst out. We know what you're doing to the snails, and we won't stand for it. His face grew serious. What? Kili continued. We know that you're holding them hostage. Opsa looked at Kili. Hostage? Kili gulped and said, prisoner. We know that you're holding them prisoner. Flemmer stared at Kili for a few moments and then burst out laughing. He laughed so hard it must have gotten whiplashed as his neck snapped back. The secretary joined in, though from her nervous tone it was obvious that she didn't know what she was laughing at. Finally, Flemmer calmed down a bit and said, We're not holding the prisoner. They're free. He started laughing again. To go any time they wish. At this point, the secretary knew what to laugh at and joined in. Even Opsa found herself smiling. It was a pretty stupid thing to say. Kili burned beet red. What are you doing to those poor snails? Flemmer stopped laughing. The secretary kept laughing for about 5 seconds before she realized that no one else was and then stopped. She looked around nervously, trying to guess what people were going to laugh at next. Obviously, she didn't want to be left out. Flemmer said, We're not really mistreating the snails. You're making pills out of them, Kili said. Yes and no. We're making it out of their slime. Ew. Kili stuck out her tongue. Opsa took up Kili's slack and asked, Why are you teaching them to scream? Flymer went through a range of expressions in a short period of time. Confusion, realization, shock, anger, embarrassment, and finally amusement. He said, "You really think what we're doing hurts the snails?" Opsa said, "It doesn't?" "Not at all. Not really. We're helping them." Kili cranked her nose doubtful. "How is making them scream helping them?" Flymer said, "Because it protects them from the bats, and more importantly, from people." Opsa and Kili both said, "What?" at the same time. "Well, it does, doesn't it? After all, I'm quite familiar with your father complaining about how it affects milk production at council meetings." Opsa sat down in the nearest chair that she could find. "Does it affect Kip Bat's milk?" "It does. It's minimal. Your father has anecdotal evidence. We have scientific evidence. Around here, people listen to your father. At Sectorcom, they listen to us. That's why we haven't had to sell chemicals to your father that would kill the snails." Kili asked, "What about the Star Train?" "Pesticides and the like can't be brought in that way. Only by freighter, and quite frankly, no one has it coming that way this often. Milk goes out by train, but harmful chemicals don't come in. That's why so many farmers milk bats instead of grow crops. That's where the money is." Opsa nodded. "Crops don't make enough money, that's what my dad says." Flymer shrugged. "I can't blame your dad for wanting to feed his family, but these snails do a lot of good." Kili tilted her head and asked, "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" "The drug we make out of the snail slime helps burn victims. It's called skinlenol. It basically rebuilds skin when you spray it on." Kili beamed. "Oh, I've heard of that. That's what they used on my friend Yick when he got hurt." Opsa said, "Can't you just get that from the snails in a protected area?" Flymer smiled at the irony. "You mean imprison them?" "No. We're an organic pharmacy. We only interfere with nature when it's absolutely necessary. Besides, while the snails might not interfere with the bat's milk, the snails don't seem able to produce enough slime in captivity. We haven't been able to figure out why." "Well, it might help if you didn't keep sending the scientists who came to study them away." Flymer winked at Opsa. "You figured that out too, huh? Well, we've got a good reason for that. The snails can be used to make a bad drug that lets you look like someone else. Right now, only a few people know that. But if word leaked out, then every criminal in existence would be trying to find them. We quietly work to send them away so they don't find out what the snails can really do." Kili said, "So if we told anyone, that would be bad for the snails?" Opsa was annoyed. She wasn't sure what she was annoyed at, but she didn't say anything at first. She just listened. Flymer said, "That's right. What is your name, by the way?" "Kili. I'm Opsa's cousin. Pleased to meet you." Flymer shook his hand, Flymer offered his hand and Kili shook it. Kili said, "I think we can promise not to tell anyone. You don't have to kidnap us or anything, do you?" Flymer laughed. "No, I don't think so. People are more important than snails, at least they are to me." Opsa was about to burst until Flymer made that comment. Something about it made her feel better. She grumbled, "We need to go." Kili said, "I can't understand what you're saying." "We need to go. We need to go home. They're probably looking for us right now." Kili blanched. "Oh, right. We do need to get back. The last thing I want to do is get us into more trouble. That's what got me sent out here in the first place." Opsa finally smiled and shook her head. She looked at Flymer and thought a few moments. Finally, she said, "All right." She shook her hair. She played with her hair a bit. "I won't tell anyone about the snails. I doubt they'd believe me anyway." The last month of Kili's summer vacation came and went very quickly. The girls were friends now, and actually enjoyed spending time with each other. After a week or so, the milking season died down, and preparations for the harvest, such as it was, came in with the associated balls, concerts, dances, and presentations. Kili learned a lot about the local culture in a very short period of time. And then summer was gone, and Opsa found herself standing at the terminal for the Star Train with Kili on the first clear, crisp dawn of fall. Opsa's mother was there as well, but she was more busy spending time making sure all of Kili's luggage got on board than spending time with Kili. It wasn't mean or unintentional, just benevolently typical. Opsa looked at Kili. So, do we call this the summer of snails or something?" Kili giggled. "I like that." Opsa scowled. "I don't. I was kidding." "I like it." "Well, I don't." "Well, what should we call it then?" Kili said. "How about the summer you came over and spent the summer here?" "That's kind of long," Kili thought. "How about we need a shorter name? How about the long summer?" "It seems kind of short for me, actually." Kili chuckled. Kili checked her ticket for the 10th time to make sure she still had it. Summer from hell? Opsa smiled. Hey! Opsa smiled and hugged Kili. It was just a summer. It was fun. The shrill whistle of the train filled the station. It wasn't really a whistle from the train, of course, but people liked the way it sounded. Opsa said, I enjoyed having you here. Kili smiled. Maybe I can come back sometime. Opsa smiled despite herself. Maybe you can visit us sometime. Kili bounced up and down at the thought. Opsa shrugged. I'll miss you, Opsa. Yeah, me too. I'll miss you. Opsa's mother appeared one more time. They hugged 3 or 4 more times, and then Kili was gone. School was starting, and it left Opsa to realize, much to her extreme disgust, that she missed Kili. She must have done something horrible to embarrass her next year. Opsa's mother said that there might be a next year after all. Opsa was not so busy thinking about what that might be that she didn't even, Opsa was so busy thinking about what that might be that she didn't even realize that she was looking forward to Kili's return. So I'm going to give this story an A, arguably an A minus, but definitely an A. It is one of my better ones, and I've always known that. I totally understand why this story wasn't bought. People that buy science fiction stories for magazines or read science fiction stories typically like wonder or interesting characters or interesting places or plot twists. You know, the bomb is here and we have to do X, Y, and Z, and it's utterly, incredibly important that we do X, Y, and Z. And, you know, it basically comes down to, this is whimsical, and there is a genre for whimsical, but it doesn't tend to overlap in fantasy or science fiction, and there is that. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind comes to mind, but even that is saying something larger about memory, and this is really a coming-of-age, young adult fiction in a science fiction fantasy setting. I'm sure that there's young adult fiction, but even that tends to be about, the noble has to save the lost kingdom or a love, and this is just 2 young girls solving a bizarre mystery involving snails. I'm glad I wrote it. I'll be honest, I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote this. I do like writing weird things for the sake of writing weird things, but as a cis male white dude writing science fiction for young adult teen girls about snails is one of the things that sometimes even I don't understand why I do things in the lens of time. A couple of things did stand out to me as I looked at this. One of which is that anybody who's been raised after Generation X, specifically a millennial or a Gen Z or Gen Y, would wonder how the hell their parents wouldn't let them, wouldn't be monitoring them all the time. And my counter argument to that is societies come and go in terms of how much they monitor their kids, right? These days, something like this is completely implausible because the idea of not monitoring your kids 24/7 is just anathema. But I would make the argument that, this is a rural community. And in the future, they might realize that there are social costs to being a helicopter parent. And on top of that, they probably do have ways of technologically tracking a child down to the last molecule in the future. So they might not have to pay, super close attention when they can just check the satellite feed and say, oh, there they are. The other thing that immediately comes to mind is... like I said, the interesting thing about this story is it doesn't really fit categorization. I'm glad I wrote it. I doubt I would ever write something like this again. Right now I'm working on something called Project NIMBY, which is about transhumanism. But even then, I kind of have a reason for writing it, which is to show that the future isn't what we think it is in terms of how humanocentric it's going to be. And this future is not only very humanocentric, it shows that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And some things about this, I do think, assuming humans are around and we do have interstellar travel, I think would be similar, right? Country versus city and stereotypes are very, very common and have always existed as long as humans have existed. And given the fact that we're still going to have rural worlds and urban worlds, probably, I could see something like this happening. So, the snails are not super plausible, in my opinion, but that wasn't the point of the story in the first place.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!